Hi, everyone. My name is Bryan Garsten. I'm a professor of political science and chair of the Humanities Program at Yale just now. And I'm really happy to be here today to host a conversation with Dr. Jon Baskin and Dr. Anastasia Berg. They together recently authored an op-ed in the New York Times on reopening the American mind. This op-ed came from an introduction they've written to a new book of collected essays that come from The Point magazine, which they are both editors of. Dr. Baskin is also an instructor at the New School of Social Research, and Dr. Berg is joining us from Israel, where she teaches philosophy as an assistant professor at Hebrew University of Jerusalem. So today we're going to have a discussion about their ideas about how to renew humanistic inquiry, how to sustain the kind of enduring conversations about big questions, what it means to live together, what is justice, and so on. And I'm particularly interested in their essay and their op-ed because they make the point that the so-called crisis of the humanities is not mainly a crisis of enrollments at universities or how many tenure-track jobs exist in the country, but a crisis of where in society the rest of us, all citizens, can engage in these kinds of conversations together. So here's how we're going to proceed. I'm going to start off by asking them a few questions, and we'll go back and forth for about half an hour with that conversation. And then we have a few of you have submitted questions in advance, and we'll turn to those questions first, but then we'll have open Q&A. And you can submit questions to that open Q&A anytime via Zoom's Q&A feature. And there are people backstage who will be sorting through those and will feed them to me at the right time. So you can start submitting those questions, not via chat, but via the Q&A option at any time. But in the meantime, we're going to get going. So welcome to both of you. It's nice to meet you. I wanted to start by asking really about how other people can imitate what you've done. That is, The Point magazine is a fantastic set of conversations that exist online and even on paper. But that's just one space in society where you're starting this kind of conversation. Where else can it happen outside universities? What do you have in mind? What other kinds of public spaces are there? And maybe I'll, because we're on Zoom, it helps to identify particular people. Anastasia, if you would go first.
If it's all right, I'm going to let Jon start us off. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, so thanks for having us, Bryan, and it's really cool to be at the Hertog Foundation, which is, of course, also one of these spaces where I think there's a real kind of public conversation around the humanities that takes place outside of a university. In the op-ed, we name, I guess I'll answer the question sort of two ways. The first is really sort of concrete institutions that are doing this right now, and in the op-ed, we name a few of those. The biggest one, obviously, or that could do it right now, is secondary school, and in high schools and even middle schools. There are countries where I think students are sort of trusted to engage with philosophy and literature and the humanities in a much more, just a much more serious way than I think happens in a lot of our public schools here. But then we're also really interested in sort of after those 4 years in college, you know, we talk about in the op-ed how Bloom saw the university as this privileged space where people could engage these deep questions. But then after that, you know, it was over. He always said, we only have 4 years. And so we really feel like that shouldn't be true. You shouldn't only have 4 years to do these, to reflect in the way the humanities can help you do. And so some of the places we mention in the op-ed are the Graham School, which is a continuing education. And that's obviously, it's not the only place that does that, but I have a kind of personal connection to the Graham School. I always remember my grandparents were children of the Depression who grew up in Chicago. And when they died, I remember cleaning out their house and finding these books of, you know, Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics with their notes all through them. And, you know, neither of them had a chance to study the humanities in college, but as in their 60s and 70s, they've been able to do it there. And there are other things we mentioned, like Books at Work, which is a program that brings sort of reading groups to professional environments. We just recently got an essay in proposal for the magazine about a organization called For You that does art with where artists work with the elderly and talk with the elderly about art. And there are programs to bring the humanities to prisons. Some of those are actually based in universities. So there are all kinds of ways in which there are some concrete ways in which people are doing this, and you can imagine all those programs being bigger. But the more general thing I just would want to say is I think we were interested in the op-ed and in general in this idea of the humanities just being projected as a value of the society, something that people ought to have the opportunity to do wherever they are in life. And you might think, for instance, of the way we think of therapy in our culture, and the way that we think that at all points in people's lives and all different kinds of institutions, if they want to, they should be able to go to therapy and talk about their life, and the problems they're having. And it's not a perfect example because I think the humanities therapy doesn't quite get at the pleasurable aspect of the humanities fully. But I think just the idea that there are even some universities now where therapy is advertised more than the humanities are. And I think that just the idea that the humanities are valued in that kind of way as like a fundamental, almost a right, but maybe not a right, but at least, a fundamental thing that in a democratic society, people should be able to engage in. And that's part of making the big decisions in their life and part of living a full life. And I think that's something that, in a sort of more general sense, we'd like to see in the kind of society we'd imagine where these conversations were more woven into the fabric of our whole lives.
And if I may just add briefly to that, I think that the recent sort of long months, for all the pain and tribulations they brought into our lives, they have shown us the possibility of another way of forming communities around common interests. And so I've witnessed, in addition to all these institutional frameworks that Jon has been mentioning, I've been noticing both in the US and in Europe and here in Israel, sort of organic formations where people who have a PhD and have studied something, may or may not be teaching at a university, offer a class, invite people to join them, create a little community around a common interest or a set of questions. And I think this time has spurred people not just to try and fill out their kind of free time, which it also has, but also to ask, there is kind of a spirit of a new era, and ask themselves what kind of interest they want to develop and how they see themselves going into the future, and what kind of sort of intellectual skills they want to be bringing on. So I think this is those kind of developments make us optimistic about the stuff that we talk about.
Well, let me pick up on exactly that optimism, because that is a striking feature of the op-ed and of the book's introduction. And, it comes at a moment when the news is filled with just the opposite, with questions of why so many people are so invested instead in a polarized media environment, and whatever conspiracy theories and other forms of unthinking. And yet you convey a kind of optimistic faith in public thoughtfulness, you could say. So where do you get that faith, and what do you think the limits are of that?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think putting it in terms of faith is just right, and that's because sometimes people ask us sort of, so how do you know that people are capable of what you're sort of saying that they're capable of, which is public thoughtfulness? And I think our answer usually is, well, I don't know that we know that. What I know is that several things. Well, first of all, I don't think that the question of whether or not people are able to converse in a way that's not characterized by polarization is just a question of sort of a stable state they're in. They are either one way or another. What we found in our work in the magazine for the past decade is that when you address people a certain way, with respect, both to where they're coming from and also to their ability to listen and to change their minds and to at least be open-minded to where you're coming from, I think that can have a real impact on how they conduct themselves. So first of all, it's that faith in our ability to also shape our audience, which has been a real key feature of our work in the magazine. And beyond that, I think it's also one of the things that we see and we're very concerned with is that people accept the kind of polarization and the kind of stubbornness, let's put it mildly, of the kind of general public today. And I think not a lot of people notice and give enough thought to the fact that, there's a very grim implication of this kind of view of the public to the possibility of living in a way where we deliberate about our faith together, which means really self-governing and the possibility of democracy. So when we talk about faith, we're also talking about faith in what we take to be a real condition of the possibility of us coming together and determining our faith together. And to be a little more concrete, there are two models of sort of resisting the possibility of that kind of openness. And on the one hand, we have sort of a more conservative idea of elite rule when we have sort of a wise statesman, and we have sort of a progressive idea of elite rule where we have a rule of technocrats and rule of experts. And we find that we think it's important to resist both in our work. And we think that, if it's not possible, then we wouldn't have a justification for what we're doing, because standing around and really preaching to choirs and having some sort of call and response sessions, which I think ultimately a lot of people in the media are doing, is sort of dull and unrewarding. And I would rather go to a university and just sort of do my work quietly to the side if that was all that was possible for me.
Right. I mean, I think just to pick up on that last point, I think for us, part of the essence of what it is to be public thinkers, I guess, Anastasia gave a couple of the other models of ways people think about public thinking, of like, I'm going to lecture you. But to us, that's just not an inspiring model for what we would want to do as public thinkers. And it doesn't really give you a rationale for leaving the university. So for us, that is sort of part of the essence of engaging with the public, is that, you don't know anything with certainty, but you have to have some faith that there's a public there to be engaged, and otherwise what you're doing seems pretty hollow, I think.
I should say one thing neither of us have said is also from our experience, both with our writers, by the way, and with our readers, we have been and continue being incredibly positively surprised. Even with all the faith and confidence that we come with, of hearing stories of people who have left academia after college, and sometimes even without that, and continuing living really thoughtful lives on their own. We've sort of realized how spoiled we are for having all the material conditions for continuing the kind of work that we do. And also just from the kind of reader responses, we have people writing to us from all walks of life and thanking us for, providing for a space and putting forth voices that they just wouldn't find anywhere else, and treating them with the kind of respect that they are losing in their communities. So we also do have some empirical evidence to base our confidence on. But
well, let me follow up on that. And ask a question. I feel like someone should speak up for Alan Bloom in some sense. So let me ask a question from his point of view and ask. One way of putting his point is a straightforwardly elitist one, that there are some people who are better suited for this work. But could you also put his point about the need for special places, universities, and special times of life for these conversations differently? That is, could you express this point as one about the pressure of practical life? That, in an ordinary life, there's a lot to get done. And there's also, in America, this kind of anti-intellectual way of being, which is familiar to us all. And we need places in society that offer shelter from the press of necessity and from the social kind of looking down on intellectual engagement, which I think anyone who's grown up in America can report on to some extent. I mean, there are moments when I feel teaching that the classroom is a kind of refuge from that, for my students, for the people from the local community that I bring in public-facing programs, and for myself too, honestly. So so that's not quite the elitist argument about who deserves to do this, but it is an argument for separating times and spaces for this special activity, rather than thinking it can fully permeate everyday life throughout society.
You go first, Anastasia.
Yeah, I think for us, it's really important, and I'm glad you're raising this question, because we are, products of universities. We both work at universities. slightly different roles, but we're very, very grateful for universities as continuing founds, both for ourselves and for our writers, of precisely what you're describing, Brian, which is an opportunity to do for undergraduates a certain kind of concentrated preparation intellectually and in terms of their skills for life, and also for those who choose to continue and living the weird life that we do, continue doing the kind of research that requires years of training, intellectual and skill-based training, without which you can't do all kind of work. There are certain kind of questions that you can only ask if you've been, trained for years and years, and nothing that we talk about wants to deny that. What we do think, and I think you were basically hinting at that in your own question, is that the possibility of having a certain kind of respite and break from practical life is not only possible for those 4 years for undergraduates and for those strange people who decide to stay in academia for longer, but that is something that we can continue carving out spaces. And there was a time where corporations would have a room to have, and even today you have things like this where you have, they read together a novel. And that's something that is incredibly possible. Jon was mentioning therapy. Another model you can think of is the way that sports plays a role in people's lives. And that could be, for some people, they're professional athletes and that's their whole life. And maybe that's the analogy there is to the PhD holders and the professors. And then you have people who are, do yoga once a month. And then there are people who are doing intramural sports, and there are people who are doing it in groups, and they're doing it alone, and they're doing it online, and they're doing it with their family. And some of them just take the stairs instead of the elevator, but you can find those spaces. It doesn't have to, I don't have to be with the Fitbit right now, but I can find a place in my week and a month to take care of my body. Jon was talking about the emotional well-being, and people find time in very different settings, in groups and online and alone and every day and 4 times a day, or just when they need it. And in the same way, I think that's what we want to introduce, a place where the people are invited at the level in which they're comfortable, at the level of time commitment in which they're comfortable, to include that into their lives. So really, it's not about somehow doing away with the importance of the university, but is saying, let's use the university and think about how we can use that as a model and continue having that in people's lives later on.
But one note of cynicism just about the university is, there is a question to what extent it's a refuge, or whether it can, it's becoming less of a refuge in many ways from some of both the economic, forces, something we're feeling, strongly at the college where I work right now, but everyone is, and also of some of the sort of like culture war kind of aspects that make public conversation very difficult. Those are not shut out from the walls of the university. And some people think that's a good thing, and some people think it's less good or mixed. But that's just one thing to say, is that, and of course, part of the precipitation for our op-ed was the way the pandemic was accelerating, a lot of closings of humanities departments and cutting back of jobs that have been going on for a long time already in universities. So that's just something to note about like the how durable the model of the university is at this moment. But also, the one other thing, we talk about this in the introduction to the book, is just that it's true, people have a lot of concerns that crowd into their lives that make it hard to have the time or the space to think about the humanities. But on the other hand, it's also true that all of us in our lives, there are questions that are unavoidable, that we make. There are decisions that are unavoidable that we have to make when we think about how to parent, what to eat, who to love, who to vote for, all these things that every human being, basically, how to grieve, has to deal with. And, these are things, of course, going back to the earlier analogy, now people think, oh, I have to go to psychoanalysis or therapy to think about this. But these are all things that I think those of us who have had really rich experiences with the humanities feel that reading and discussion about those books really speak to these things and inform the way we live and make those kind of decisions. So there are things every human being will come into contact with that are unavoidably call on some of these resources. And it's not optional. It's just a question of like what kind of quality of thought you're going to devote to these decisions in your life and how much you're going to be able to sort of consciously reflect and make a choice.
And I think one more thing that just this reminds me, if I may, that we mentioned very briefly in our piece, but there's also as we think about the decline of the role of humanities education, both from the perspective of the university and from the perspective of the students who are becoming perhaps more concerned with financial well-being and drifting away from the humanities, we do think that the more we as a society acknowledge the value of that kind of ability and that kind of preoccupation, at least we won't be harming universities and their dedication to the humanities, if not helping them. So how can we expect the public to be supportive of this kind of education that seems, to put it generously, for its own sake, to put it generously, useless, if we don't give them a way to participate in the fruits of that kind of work, and if we don't, as a society, uphold it as sort of noble and valuable and good.
Great. Let me move to some of the advice that you sort of give in your introductory chapter, which is to imitate Socrates. Actually, I think Benjamin Franklin gives that advice too in his autobiography, Under the Virtue of Humility, right, to imitate Jesus and Socrates. But you suggest Socrates can be a sort of model of public engagement with ideas. Not lecturing, but engaged in conversation. So can you make that more concrete for the students in the program who are watching? Maybe they want to be public intellectuals someday of a certain kind. Are there other models that you have in mind, or are there things to avoid? Are there ways they can prepare to engage in that role in a good way?
It's a hard question how to say it more concretely. I mean, this project, the point, obviously, I was there when it started 11 years ago, and we were in graduate school at the time, in these great classes where we were reading these books and having these conversations about them, and many of the conversation outside of class. And the point was an attempt to sort of say, is there a way that we could speak to the actual fundamental relevance these books have for us in this sort of Socratic way in the public? And so that was an attempt, and I think, it doesn't always work, but one place to look obviously is the writing we've tried to publish as far as like what that can look like. But I guess maybe Anastasia will have more thoughts about this, but one thing I would just say as you contemplate this, thinking about like what it is to think publicly in this Socratic way, it is important to sort of look out at the culture and at what's already being produced and think about, it's not just what you say, but sort of how you say it. What kind of model of thinking am I providing when I publish this article or say this opinion? We have a culture that's filled with people shouting their opinions at each other, shouting their sort of expert research at each other, this constant kind of lecturing and hectoring. And I think that something, you could imagine a culture that was very different, where everyone was sort of asleep and apathetic, and as an intellectual, it was your job to tell them to wake up. I think in our current culture, when we looked around, and this became more clear as the point went on, that we were sort of doing something a little different in this regard, like we did start to see this role that there really weren't a lot of people modeling a kind of generous engagement with ideas, even ideas one might disagree with, and modeling, as you said, I think humility is a really key word. This notion that it doesn't mean you don't have convictions or that you're a centrist or that you compromise on everything, but that you do have a sense of humility, that your ideas are not the only coherent or rational ones, and that when you argue for something, you model a way of remaining open or open-minded, as we call it in the intro, that is really genuine. I mean, it's not just a performance. That's an internal process too. And I think that's the thing, Arendt always says, like, the public thinking, the Socratic thinking, it's a process that goes on first within yourself, because it's partly about acknowledging that you yourself have different voices and different ideas that clash with one another, and at different moments feel different ways about things. And instead of suppressing that to write something, you find a way to actually express it in your writing or in your speaking or in whatever your public engagement is. And that's, I think that's a big part of it for me, is just that model.
I think a couple of things I would add, just we're familiar with the need for the advice and the concreteness. And I think just I mean, one thing also very interesting about the point for me, so I came on at just around the previous election, so just around the time when Trump was coming on board, and suddenly the point found itself having this new role of trying to think we have some kind of function to perform in times of increasing polarization. But that's not how the point started. And it's funny that I should be talking about it, because Jon should be really talking about it, because he was there founding it. Well, I was in diapers, but the thought was really, he's not that old, intellectually in diapers. But the thought really was that they wanted to have a place that introduced the kind of high-level rigorous thinking that we did and do in sort of our social thought classes to a general public, and that would be able to bring to questions a real depth. So part of it was just responding to a certain shallowness of a discourse, and thinking that bringing to bear deep intellectual history, seeing the history of a question, would immediately make us be able to think more thoroughly through it. So one of the concrete things to say is, don't be afraid to ask about the history of the questions that you are trying to argue about. There probably exists such a deep history. Some version of the argument you're making right now was probably made before. That's an invaluable resource for you to engage. And I continue, and I say this completely seriously and honestly, I continue to learn from our writers about every questions that they bring, oftentimes much more than I do with other publications, just because they are bringing to bear so much to what we're kind of used to seeing debated in more familiar terms. Of course, practice writing, because writing is hard and writing well is very difficult. And something that we want at the point is to, part of respecting our readers means to also respect, they kind of to think they deserve to be engaged and pulled in, and to have their passions kind of woken up by the writing, and concretely to say, if you care about something, are you doing the work as a writer to show someone else why they should care as well, which not a lot of people are doing. And just to make it maybe a little bit more concrete, although Jon was already saying this, just really asking yourself the take that you're bringing to a conversation, if it's about something very noble, or if it's about, a cancel culture and the college mentality, or if it's about the Trump presidency, or whatever it would be. Is this something that we haven't heard before? And if it's not, then what exactly is the function of you making that argument? There is room for a kind of community chanting together its own mantras, but if you want to be a public intellectual in the model that we're talking about, we really are talking about, is this going to make someone think a thought they haven't thought before? Will this be able to at least make someone consider their own assumptions that already has a convictions on this belief? And it's amazing how much we see, even pieces that are coming to us. A lot of times our response is, we're not sure if this is the kind of original and thought-provoking material that we think we should be putting more out there. So hopefully that helps any aspiring young public intellectuals.
That's great. Just my last question for you, and then we'll turn to students. Just briefly, in this whole conversation, I don't think either of you have put forward what is the kind of usual justification of the humanities, which is that it teaches us critical thinking. So I wanted to give you a chance to say why you don't turn to that familiar phrase.
So yeah, I could talk about this forever, so I'm going to try to keep it short. But critical thinking, you're right. That's often the first justification that's given, even almost the definition of what it is to be educated or to be an intellectual is to be a great critical thinker. And this is even aside from whole issues around critical theory or any of that stuff, just this idea of the skill of critical thinking. I grew up hearing this inculcated in me. That's what it was to be educated. You learn to think critically, you learn to question everything. You know, I think there's a generational aspect to this for me too, because you had mentioned, we were talking before about the Nausgard quote about against critical thinking. He grew up in this kind of world too. Just sort of like, we grew up where the big enemy was sort of advertising, and the enemy of the advertising, propaganda, mostly of the consumerist type, but sometimes political, you know, when I was growing up in the 90s. And the whole idea was, yeah, you had to learn to question it and criticize. And I think that, you know, but I think it's interesting, like, if I think about my own education and like what really inspires me as a thinker and as a student and these kind of things, is it critical thinking, or is it actually like admiration and attachment and coming in contact with great thinking and with thinking that that challenges me as opposed to me always challenging it? And I think that, of course, I don't mean to say critical thinking is a useless skill, and it is part of education, learning how to criticize something. But I think that I've seen in my own life a kind of generational shift where now critical thinking it's on steroids, and it's like we have a culture where people criticize, where people are so good at criticizing that they've sort of lost the skill of trust or of admiration and these other aspects of what I think are really important to us who care about the humanities and care about education and care about the world in general. And I think that, yeah, one of the qualities people have always connected with the magazine, I think, is a kind of sincerity and a kind of, a suspicion of critical thinking as the predominant intellectual virtue. And I think that in extra academic venues, as we've been talking about, in public venues, this is almost even more important. I still think there's like a belief out there in the public that I don't think people in the public come to the humanities for critical thinking. They actually think of it as something where they're going to be exposed to really fascinating ideas and beautiful art and, you know, thought-provoking things. And I think that this is something, you know, that we need to really strive to provide and to remember, especially when we are engaging with the public, that they're not assuming that critical thinking is the only thing that there is.
Great. Well, if it's okay, let's move to students' questions. First, I'm going to invite Denton Knight from the U.S. Military Academy to ask a question.
Hi, good afternoon, Dr. Baskin and Dr. Berg. Thank you so much for coming in. I really appreciate everything you have to share. And I'll say The Closing of the American Mind, I read it as a freshman in college, and it really like opened my mind to the value of the liberal arts education. And it was really important for me personally, even as I've come to engage and think about whether I really agree or disagree with everything. It was important at the time with which I read it. So my question has a lot to do with what we discussed at the beginning of this lecture and conversation, but this idea of the optimism that y'all have. And while I think in principle, this idea of we can expand the love of the humanities to all Americans sounds excellent, of course, like how realistic is it really? Especially this in the age of distraction as well as the age of technology, it's kind of this double-edged sword where we have technology that lets us do conversations like this virtually. You can tune into Harvard classes, you can engage in all these new different ways. But at the same time, what do we see people doing a lot? We see them flipping through social media and using it for kind of its least productive or least engaging in the easy ways to go about it. So how do we, do you think it's even possible for people to develop the virtuous habits that are necessary to engage with thought and intellect outside of the university? I know it's hard enough here within kind of a good setting where I have mentors and the conditions to think about things critically, or not critically, but think about them deeply and really try to learn from the humanities. And B, how do we go about expanding that to the rest of the American population beyond just the university for the people that don't have the opportunity to come here and study in the university?
You want to start, Anastasia?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that's important to say, and maybe now we can model a little bit something that we've both mentioned, which is, so if you take a little bit of historical perspective on the question of distraction, I think we'll quickly come to realize that, you know, humans have had to work hard in order to find room for any kind of humanistic inquiry or and maybe analogous things. So I don't know, like religious practice. I mean, there are things to take us away from this kind of the different models of contemplative, reflective, devotional, whatever it would be, life. And so I think the first thing I would say is let's not overestimate the kind of challenge that social media provides. I have a newborn. That makes it very hard to engage in humanistic inquiry as well. And that's not anything new. So I think that's the first thing I would say. The second one is that, if we think about the kind of models, and these are analogies, so they're obviously already disanalogies in these cases, but we think about the way therapy is incorporated into our lives, the way sports and the health of our bodies is incorporated into our lives, then I think we start to realize the kind of diversity we have in mind of opportunity to engage in humanistic inquiry. So one thing that happens is that as we talk about expanding humanistic inquiry beyond the university, it's very easy to think that we're still talking about something like classes. So, okay, we'll have book reading groups, but we'll have them outside the university. But what we're really talking about is expanding our idea of what the permeation of humanistic inquiry as a value and as a practice into our lives would look like. You mentioned sort of habits of deep thinking. For me, and if we talked about Socrates as well, Socrates, at least the way Plato is portraying him, he didn't sit around and he didn't have a book club. We don't see him reading many texts at all. He was familiar with some, but he usually recounts the arguments for his interlocutors. And what he was doing is engaging in a certain kind of conversation that had a certain kind of, a fundamental presumption that it's possible to learn from every interlocutor. And moreover, that there was value in having that conversation publicly for others to see. And I think, as sort of we were talking about before, there is a matter of faith and how you want to position yourself. I do choose not to be cynical about the possibility of people finding their ways into conversations like that. And if they're aided by a work of art, if a certain kind of great novel is the occasion for that, or if perhaps somebody's experience and a short tract, a philosophical tract, or a song, or whatever the occasion for that kind of investigation of the questions that are important to absolutely everyone. Everyone has to ask themselves, am I going to start a family? Is it okay to bring more life into the world? How do I want to organize society? If you think about politics at all, you're asking yourself, how do I want to organize society? And so, yeah, I believe to have the faith that people can take the time and find however it works for them to learn to have those conversations productively. I don't know. I sort of want to say, are you convinced?
Well, let me move on to the next question, just because I want to make sure to get everyone in, and we can let it echo through our minds and come back to it. But the next one will come from Jack Carlson from Michigan State University.
Hello. Thank you, Dr. Baskin, Dr. Berg, and thank you, Dr. Garsten, as well. In the introduction to your book, you argue against, quote, the prevailing assumption that political commitment is incompatible with a desire for dialogue, self-reflection, or self-criticism. Today, it seems that one of the best ways to engage in political dialogue is through the use of social media. It appears that social media has done the opposite of creating space for dialogue, self-reflection, or self-criticism, and has instead created a polarized environment where those who voice unpopular opinions are taken out of context or even canceled. In my own life, I have largely turned away from social media because I worry that my opinions on important issues might be attacked by both strangers and friends who might take them out of context and refuse to engage in political dialogue. Staying silent, I have thought, might be better than voicing my opinions. Considering the benefits and consequences of social media, then, should public intellectuals try to engage in dialogue and voice their opinions on social media, or avoid it entirely?
So, good question. We struggle with this ourselves. And I think personally, I know sort of personally, it's not great for my psychic health to be on social media too much, especially engaging in these when we do get in these contentious debates, which in fact we did even about this op-ed that we published that we started by talking about. And on the other hand, I think I'm of sort of two minds of it, because social media does clearly matter, whether you'd like it to or not. It's a big part of the public when we're talking about public conversations. I don't think you can afford to ignore what goes on social media completely. It is a part of what shapes not only, you know, what happens on Twitter doesn't stay on Twitter. Like, it shapes the way journalists cover things. It shapes, it works its way. I'm sure Professor Garsten would attest into faculty meetings and classrooms, and your students are reading it. So I think that there's no kind of way to completely divide, you know, the social media world from the rest of the world. And I think if you're gonna, you know, I think if you're gonna be a public intellectual, there is, I wouldn't say a responsibility, but I think there is some reason to not abandon that field completely, and to, you know, have the courage or take the risk of getting out there. And, you know, I also think, again, it can be easy to overstate the negatives of social media. You know, there are also positives to it. The Point gets most of its articles read by a wide variety of people for very little money spent promoting or whatever, by way more people than we could have dreamed of, you know, 15 years ago, because of social media and because of people's enthusiasm for things that we publish, and conversations it starts there, which sometimes can be really fascinating, amazing conversations. And there are people that are really good at doing that. So, and being public philosophers. I don't know, we have a public philosophy column by a philosopher at University of Chicago named Agnes Callard. And she writes these columns that often get a lot of people talking. And they're really actually great conversations. They're great philosophical conversations about the topics that she writes about. And she has a real skill for kind of getting people out of their comfort zone, I think, and forcing people to really think publicly. And I think it's partly because she models it so well in her own, both in her column and in her own social media persona. So, you know, I think that's, and just, yeah, one other thing, just when you are on social media, one of the things of thinking about what you're doing too is this idea of modeling. You're not always going to change the mind of the person you're arguing with. In fact, very rarely, although, you know, it can happen. I've seen it happen. But by sort of approaching them respectfully and speaking in a way that's respectful and generous toward them, and not assuming them to be speaking in bad faith, you know, I think, again, we have some faith that this is something people see and hopefully inspires them to do the same, you know?
The modeling point is fascinating and really important. I'm going to move us on to the next question, which is a different sort of question from Emmeline McClellan from the University of Georgia.
Thank you very much, Dr. Baskin and Dr. Berg. I've really enjoyed hearing what you have to say. And in your essay, you talk about the importance of dialogue with our fellow citizens. And so as I prepare for graduate school, I've been worried that my doctoral research will be too abstruse, too narrow and focused on particular places and times to be of much interest to non-academics, or even to be of use in public conversation. And so I was wondering, as public intellectuals and successful academics, do you have any advice for a graduate student interested in engaging in the great conversation while under pressure to research and publish specifically for the academy?
So again, I'll start with the same way that Jon started answering the previous question, which is, this is something we struggle with ourselves. Definitely I do as a sort of early career academic. And so what we're talking about is the fact that there are very particular professional pressures to do certain kind of work. So even very basically the kind of work that is just not part of a public conversation. And how do we find time in our lives to do anything else? And then there's a question of the relation between the two, between the kind of work that we do as academics and the work that we do as sort of public intellectuals. So I think on the first thing, I would just say that is a struggle, and that's something that one has to sort of simply navigate. But on the second, I will say that for me, I found, as we mentioned, my academic work is in philosophy, and then there's whatever I do with the rest of my time. And I really have found that these two sides of my work have been very nurturing and very sort of productive going together. It is not because I take my philosophical work and present it publicly, or I do philosophy necessarily about what I'm writing or editing for the Point. but it's because I think my staying in touch with public conversations and constantly trying to think what would be the kind of original responsible contribution that is needed right now, if in terms of tone or if in terms of point. That kind of awareness has, I think, really helped me have a certain kind of critical eye towards my research in a way that has helped me sustain my interest in it. And that, what do I mean by that? When we move from being undergraduates to graduate students, we find ourselves working at a much narrower field. We're becoming more and more specialized. And oftentimes we find ourselves with the kind of project or doing the kind of work that we're going to have sustain us for the next decade. Right? We're going to start writing a PhD thesis. And I think that for me, I've always found myself asking, you know, can I tell myself a story? Not that I have to do that every day, but can I in principle tell myself a story that explains to me why this matters? You know, and it's not because it immediately contributes to the greater American or world population, my particular kind of specialized conversation, but can I tell a story that explains to me why there's any justification for that kind of specialized work? And I think that has been really, really, really important as I see, you know, colleagues and friends commit themselves to kind of projects within a few years, they are feeling that they're sort of empty and hollow and they can't really justify it to themselves. So I think that's one thing. And the other thing is that, you know, if you're lucky, there are interesting syntheses of the work. So something that I started working on and I thought had nothing to do with my real academic work, and it was thinking it was actually for a point symposium. So we have these collections of essay called symposiums. And it was for an issue about what are children for. And then I and another editor for the point wrote something about thinking about how can we thinking about children and families in the world. And that became both a book and something that I'm now working on both professionally, and I really got to bring to bear all this philosophical work and training that I've been doing for years on this question that I was interested in because of something that was happening in the discourse. So I think there are always these opportunities for the kind of fruitful synergy.
But just one funny, interesting, like over the years, we've worked with so many academics who are writing for public writing and for the first or second time, you know, and often they will start by wanting to sort of write from their expertise and explain to you what they're, you know, they'll sort of dive right into what they're studying and they expect you to be interested in it. And oftentimes it's not that interesting to me initially. And or I can tell it won't be that interesting to our audience initially. But I've frequently, several times had this breakthrough where over email or something, I'll say to them, can you explain to me why you first became interested in this field? Mm. And they'll write a paragraph back that will then become the first paragraph of the essay or become like the most crucial part of the essay, because it will sort of retrace the link between them being a normal human being and them being a scholar of this topic. And sort of, that's actually a fascinating thing. And I think like it's an important thing, as Anastasia was saying, even as an academic, it's important to keep track of that, to sort of orient yourself. And then it's also important, very important, essential if you're going to write for a public audience, to think about what was the motivation that got me into this field in the first place. And, you know, yeah, I think that's, so having that sort of two-way path in mind, I think can enrich both sides of your work.
Fantastic. We're going to move on to a question from the audience from Elzas Question.
My name is Elza. I graduated from Dartmouth in 2018, and I now work in immigration law in New Mexico. And I'm excited that I get an opportunity to ask my question. In your introduction to the opening of the American mind, you write, among today's leftist and liberal intellectuals, many who reject elitism toward the public in the strongest possible terms in theory, seem unable to help recapitulating it in practice. So I am that liberal intellectual. I recognize my own elitism and I seek to root it out of my behavior. Yet despite my best efforts, my subconscious elitism regularly creeps into my daily life. For example, I will find myself thinking, well, I graduated from Dartmouth, so I should be making more money than person X for elitist reason Y. And it's ugly, but it has crossed my mind. So in what ways do you think the dark side of your elitism creeps into your life? And what is your advice to young professionals like me who genuinely strive to reject elitism and want to become more open-minded?
You go first. This is for you, Anastasia. I don't have any elitism.
Oh, yeah. Let's see. That's a great question. How does wait, I had something I wanted to say about it, but I was hoping John will start. How do you prevent elitism from creeping into your mind, to your life? So I think what we don't want to elide, and what we don't want to be naive about, is that which we do see. So part of the elitism that we describe, and that I do think this happens especially on the left, but although we obviously think there's elitism on the right as well, is a kind of disavowal of one's elitism as one is practicing it. So I think the first thing to do, and much more important than before even rooting out, is also just acknowledging the ways in which, perhaps we are not in the perfect position to speak for the working class. And I think that's already a big accomplishment for a sort of, so where you are, Elzas, big already accomplishment for a liberal or progressive thinkers to just be able to be very clear about the kind of advantages and that one has and where one is speaking from. But I think this is something actually I think Agnes has been, I've worked with Agnes Kaller that we've mentioned, and I think that's something that is very important to her. And so I've been thinking about it, which is that, there's another way of talking about elitism, which is something like, aspiring to excellence. John has mentioned allowing text to be inspiring and having a passionate commitment about something that's great. And that's not something that we want to lose as we're trying to target a very specific meaning of elitism, which is, it's not so much not having your own professional aspirations or your own intellectual aspirations, but it's really simply not believing in anybody else's ability or in large swaths of the population ability to lead a thoughtful life, to ask the kind of questions that I'm asking. We can all strive for excellence in in whatever field. I feel very strongly about my Kant scholarship, and I don't think anything that we say is standing in contradiction with that. But what we're talking about is those kind of questions that are basic to our lives. How should I lead my life? Who should I trust? How are my friendship going to look like? How are we going to live together? And just thinking that this is the one place where we and our fellow citizens have a possibility of engaging in conversation as equals. That's the element of elitism that we want to target. But we also want to celebrate the possibility of greatness, artistic and cultural, and as writers and as thinkers and as professionals.
And I think one thing, just the Socratic model that we talked about earlier, and that model of a thinker, I think is a kind of check on a certain kind of very natural way that elitism can creep in. Because, just to take like a common argument that a lot of like left highly educated people will make about like constantly talking about how irrational these voters are, or these people are, they don't vote their interests and they don't do this. But then the Socratic model sort of requires of you that you then turn that question back on yourself and think about, well, do I really vote my interests? What are my interests? Like, how are my economic interests like combined with my values and do I live those interests? And I think always sort of like, in what way, where does irrationality play a role in my life? Like the thing where you sort of turn the question back on yourself and genuinely ask of yourself the same question you're asking of whoever you've sort of othered as the people, I think is really important. And it's just a really good practice and can help with that issue.
Excellent question and great insightful answers. We have time for just one more question, which is going to be from Claire Ashmead.
Hi, I'm so excited to hear from you guys. Actually, I was first introduced to my love of the humanities by a man named Jonathan Thacker. Not sure if you know him, but he was a great teacher when I was at Princeton, graduated 2017. And my question is about one of the thinkers that he often brought up with our course to help clarify our thinking. And that's George Orwell. Talk about a man who had great essays, but never did anything beyond Eton in terms of higher education. And when I think about people whose essays and writings I truly admire, they often don't have a PhD, like Abraham Lincoln would be another great example. So my question is, can people like that who don't have a PhD, who are really outside of academia, still make it, whether that's in the form of a public intellectual or somebody who's just contributing great writing? And are they allowed to succeed? Because we are in a pretty status-oriented, degree-oriented culture. Thank you.
I hope so. I think this goes to the essence of some of why we want the humanities to take all these different forms that are not just in the university. And I think we've certainly had people write essays for the point that are great and that are not PhDs. And in fact, we had a recent essay. I don't know if you saw it. First of all, by the way, Johnny Thacker's a founding editor of The Point, and also one of my great teachers. So in a friend capacity and colleague. So he is very inspiring to be around in thinking about the humanities. But yeah, I think that, and I mean, I think that's part of, even to go back to the last question about thinking about elitism and stuff, is that you certainly should not need any kind of credential to write a great essay in the humanities. And there are lots of historical examples, like you mentioned, and there are many, I think, in our magazine. And we actually had a piece recently by a guy named Joey Keegan called "Wisdom That Is Woe." I think that's what it was called. That was about sort of, he grew up poor in Florida in a community where very few people went to college, and it was sort of about his search his whole life for public intellect and for finding places where thinking was really happening. And he actually described being kind of disappointed when he finally got into a university environment where he realized, well, a lot of these people actually don't care about thinking. They care about the credential or this or that, other things that seem ancillary to me, and sort of talked about the different people he'd met in his life. And it was also partly a review of George Scialaba, who's another example of someone, a contemporary essayist, actually, who's not credentialed in that kind of way, I don't think. But, and he talked about, the essay was sort of about this search for the place where thinking was really happening in the world. And it was amazing the kind of response we got to that essay. There are a lot of people out there that really identified with his story and with trying to find communities where they could find that. And it doesn't always have to take the form of writing great essays. It can, like we've been saying, I think it's just as important to create these communities, institutions where these conversations can happen. And it's actually something we're sort of working on as a magazine, is trying to think about ways to put together out beyond the magazine, because a literary magazine too, as accessible as you might try to make it, there's a certain there are barriers to people finding out about it and sitting down to read these essays, in a lot of people's lives. So trying to find other public ways and sort of, instead of answering your question yes or no, I guess one way I would say is like we're hoping we can contribute to it being easier for people outside of the university and outside of these channels to do this kind of work and have these kind of conversations.
Great. Well, look, let me invite everyone in the audience to check out The Point magazine online, and the book, The Opening of the American Mind. And look, thanks so much to Anastasia.
We're in print.
John.
We're in print.
We're in
Yes,
print.
that's our latest issue.
Thanks so much to our guests for a really great conversation that models the sort of thing that they'd like there to be more of. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian.
Thanks so much, Brian. Thank you, everyone, for coming out today.